Right, I guess it's time to take one for the team then, because no, I don't want the McLaren F1 GTR, I don't want the 1952 Mercedes SL race car, I want this, the 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C, for 20 million credits, roughly the same price as having both of those two cars that I just mentioned, that are also currently both available in the legendary dealership with this Alfa at the time of me recording this and buying the car. But alas, the car has been bought, so what do we have here? Well, it's a very special car, that's for sure, hence the price tag. Only 10 of these were made as road-going variants of the race cars that won the infamous 1000 mile Mille race 1, 2 and 3 in 1936, and then in 37 they came back and won it again. Granted, by today's standards, 177 horsepower doesn't sound like too much, but as you can tell from the footage where I'm driving this car completely stock for the first time, it's plenty to be getting on with, as the car of course is still sliding around. And of course we have to consider the fact that it's just huge. At 5 meters long, it's roughly the same length as a Boeing 747, although it doesn't weigh too much being an old car, only 1300 kilograms, just over. And the performance point rating comes in at a seemingly fairly reasonable 377. But that's what we're going to find out now. Just how reasonable is it compared to another Italian car with pretty much an identical performance point rating, just one that happens to be some 70 years newer. Yes, this is a bone stock Abarth 500, and now we're going to have a drag race. And there we have it, a fairly convincing victory for the old-timer there. It launched miles better. By the quarter mile it was already over a second ahead, and by the time we got to the full mile that was about 2.5 second lead. But of course you also need to stop that speed, so I did a quick brake test with these two, and perhaps unsurprisingly victory swung the other way this time, although not by a massive amount. Anyway, time for some corners. So here we are at Laguna Seca, first off in the Alfa Romeo. Let's just see what this thing is like to drive out the box when you are 20 million credits worse off. And the answer is kind of how you'd expect, but pretty damn fun actually for me. Trying to set a good time in this, you of course do have to be careful, but once you learn the way that the car drives, it is a lot of fun. You just kind of tip it into the corner, you'll know it will oversteer a bit, but then you try and straight line your exit as much as you can, because the diff is hilariously useless. That's no surprise of course, but it's just an exercise in keeping your momentum up as much as you can and getting around the lap, and I had a lot of fun doing it, trying to set a decent lap time. And of course, despite losing out to the Abarth in the braking test, the brakes didn't feel like they were overwhelmed or you had to brake any further back than you would in a normal road car. It was all kind of instinctive when you were driving it. The power isn't pushing it too hard, it's just enough to make it an enjoyable experience and make sure you don't get bored, keeping you on your toes a little bit. In all honesty, I had more fun driving it than I did the Abarth. It's still not bad, don't get me wrong, it's kind of what you'd expect though. You've got to be a bit careful with the traction, coming out of slower corners, of course being front wheel drive you don't want to spin away that power and understeer, although of course there is only 130 horsepower, so you have to be really aggressive for that to be much of an issue. But yeah, overall it's what you'd expect. Of course the brakes are a bit better, which is nice, although I have more of a problem braking in this car because it dives a lot. The rear goes a bit light and it can mess up your entry to some corners if you're not anticipating it. And also it gets a bit phased by the sausage curbs, which are awful in general, but on multiple occasions they sent this thing a long way up onto two wheels, which is kind of funny but not very conducive to going quickly, of course. But while we're on the subject, once I finally did get my fastest lap, a clean lap of the 5 I gave myself in each car, which one was faster overall? Place your bets now. Despite winning on the straight line front, the Alfa wins again against the 500 by a few tenths around Laguna Seca, of course both in the bone stock form, so it's seeming as though this thing is actually pretty good for its PP level, which bodes well if you want to take this thing racing, which I do. But before that, we're going to turn the wick up a little bit, modify it. I was thinking of doing it to a certain PP level, but then I decided nah, and just threw all the mods on it and see where we end up. Well, here we are, another few $100,000 worse off, but the 8C now has over 300 horsepower and weighs barely over a ton. This is running on sports hard tyres. I haven't done any tuning yet, but I'm going to take it into a race it's eligible for, slap a quick setup on it and just see what happens. And here we are, and what's happened is I've ruined it. I've completely ruined it. Yep, there's no way around this one. This thing cannot handle the level of power it now has. The oversteer is now quite snappy, and while it doesn't lift off because I managed to engineer some understeer into the setup trying to get rid of the drifting problem, it doesn't really work, and once the rear lets go, it is a pain to get it back. You've just got to make sure that rear does not step out of line when you're trying to win this race. And if you don't win it, granted you can still win a race against the AI, it's just a very on a knife edge experience. I tried varying different setups, going extreme on certain aspects, and just as a note, the performance point rating is very drastically affected when you start tuning in this car. Like with your ride height, if I went down past a certain threshold on the ride height, or even took the power restrictor down by 1%, at times once you reach a certain level, it could go down by as much as 50 performance points from just 1mm of ride height or 1% of power being restricted. Very bizarre. But yeah, overall from the onboard that you're seeing right now, you can see how careful I'm having to be with it and how delicate with my inputs you have to be if the rear does step out of line for it to not just spit you back the other way. It's like driving some of the American muscle cars standard, like in the early stages of the cafe missions, but a bit worse. Really, really not fun. This thing could be useful much lower down to its original performance point rating with some minor upgrades, but with this amount of power, it can't take it. I can't really blame it for that, but it is what it is. You can see how much I'm struggling here. I was catching the AI, but eventually this happened and, well, I gave up. And I decided that it's time for this car to lose the last remaining shreds of dignity that it had left. Yes, look at that! Isn't that brilliant? This thing works better as a drift car, to be honest. It's still not particularly easy, but it's ridiculous, it's kind of fun, and hey, it's here for your viewing pleasure, because unless you are fanatical about getting every car in the game, I wouldn't spend your 20 million credits on it, of course. I think that goes without saying, but I can't say that I regret spending the money myself. But there we have it, that's what it's like owning this 1938 Alfa Romeo 8C. I hope you've enjoyed the video. F's in the chat for my credit balance. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.